David, having a conversation with Osiris, and I am so excited to dive in. There's tons to talk about. I want to just say good morning to you first, because it's 1 o'clock in the morning in Mexico. How are you feeling?
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. I am very glad to be here and to share with your audience some issues very important for the psychedelic research. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy you could make it, and I feel very guilty that you've stayed up late, but there's wonderful work that you've been covering, and I think I want to start off just by asking you, what does it feel like to be a philosopher, a doctor of philosophy, and when did you first become a philosopher? Kind of when you were a little boy, were you a philosopher back then in how you thought about kind of reality, or did something happen later in life where you took that turn?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because I was a professional soccer player, right?
Oh,
During
wow.
my teenage years. And I start study philosophy when I was a professional soccer player. Unfortunately, nobody says nothing because I was a professional soccer player, right? But when I decide to leave the sports or soccer, football, to study philosophy and then start the problems, right? The problems with the world, the problems with the worldview, the problems with the different scales of values. But anyway, I start to study at the national. I start to study philosophy at the National University of Mexico, and of course, it was a hard and long journey. But fortunately, I am very glad to be here, to be here, and to share my research regarding philosophy and psychedelics.
Hmm. When did psychedelics first kind of come into your life and kind of merge with the philosophical approaches that you were kind of studying?
Yeah, sure. I start with some experience. Of course, I am in Mexico, and in indigenous peoples of Mexico have a very deep roots in the use of psychedelics and entheogens for millennia. And in Mexico, it's it's not strange, for example, to have some psychedelic experience. For example, make pilgrimage to the desert in order to know the peyote, right, in the north of Mexico, but also travel to the south of Mexico in order to know the rituals and or the knowledge of indigenous peoples regarding psilocybin mushrooms. I live in a privileged place because, according to Schultz and Hoffman, in this very well-known book, "The Plants of the God," Mexico it's the country with the largest amount of psychoactive plants, fungi, and animals in the world, right? According to Schultz and Hoffman. And also, it's the region of the world in which these psychoactive substances have impact more in the culture and in the worldview of indigenous peoples. Nowadays, 68 indigenous peoples lives in Mexico, and moreover, um, Mexico is the region in the world in which the largest amount of psilocybin mushrooms grow up, right? Almost 50 different species of psilocybin mushrooms grow nowadays in Mexico. And in the whole world, there are almost 200. This means that a quarter of the psilocybin mushrooms of the whole species of psilocybin mushrooms grows in Mexico. You can understand that psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, and different psychedelics have a very deep cultural impact in Mexico. So I start with these experiences, but my professional research start when the conservative Mexican government launched the Mexican version of the war on drugs. And I noticed as a philosopher that this was a nonsense this politics of prohibition, this politics of punishment, the militarization of the country, a lot of guns, and so on and so on. And I noticed that it was necessary to reflect on this issue. And of course, I was young, and in a very naive approach, I submit an academic proposal to the National University in order to develop a psychotropic philosophy, not a psychedelic. This was on 2007, right? 15 years ago, or a little bit more. Of course, it was not on the horizon the psychedelic renaissance. And of course, my project was rejected, and I had to move to the underground and continue my research, not outside, but at least in a different way that normal academic research was done. And this was the beginning of my professional research on the philosophical uses of psychedelics. This is not new. It has almost 20 years. And of course, it was a difficult and a hard time and effort. But I am very glad that fortunately the things are changing now, and we are now experiencing a different time, a different approach. And for example, today you and me we are talking about these issues freely, and of course, not only you and me, but also for your audience and all the people that are interested in this topic.
Yeah, and we should not take that for granted, that we feel safe and that we are kind of privileged that we can talk about psychedelics publicly now. And it's very interesting what you're saying, Osiris, that the war on drugs that's been exported around the world changes our psyche, our kind of conceptualization of psychedelics, plant medicine, but maybe also spirituality. And I'd be interested to ask you a question about colonization of Mesoamerica and the new ideas and conceptualizations around perhaps ethics, morality, but particularly around plant medicines. What kinds of impact did that have around the relationship with people in Mesoamerica pre-colonization and then post-colonization, around their relationship with sacred plant medicines, with ceremonies, with community? And also part of that question, I suppose, is saying, what do we know about Mesoamerican kind of prehistory before colonization? How far back does it go to our knowledge with
Yeah,
psychedelic plant
fortunately,
medicines?
fortunately, it's possible to know a little bit more about the ritual and therapeutic and divinatory uses of psychedelics during pre-colonial times, thanks to the archaeological and historical evidence. But of course, we have to be very careful regarding the use of primary sources. I have a professional training on this issue. I studied a master in Mesoamerican studies at National University, and also I am a Nahuatl speaker, right? I am a speaker of an indigenous languages, of Nahuatl indigenous languages. And part of my research, for example, has been focused on the history and archaeology of psilocybin mushrooms in Mesoamerica, and history and archaeology of peyote in Mesoamerica. I developed this research with Professor Erika Dick in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan. And I found a lot of interesting things in the study of codices. For example, according to the archaeological evidence, it is possible to talk about sacred and spiritual uses of psilocybin mushrooms or psychoactive mushrooms in Mesoamerica since 3,000 years ago. The ancient archaeological evidence are the Maya mushroom stones from Caminaljuyu in Guatemala. And the significance of these Maya mushroom stones is that all of them were found within the archaeological context. Regarding peyote, for example, recent research provide data um, from the uses of peyote in northern Mexico and the south of the United States, mainly science, 5,000 years before Christ, right?
Wow. Yeah.
Almost 7,000 years from our era. And of course, for example, it's more accurate, or it's more easy, for example, to find archaeological data from the peyote uses, because the psilocybin mushrooms are mainly water, right? And due to this, it's not very easy to find this information. On the other hand, for example, regarding peyote, it's possible to study the pollen, the soil, and other different elements. And it's possible, for example, to find ancient data of these ritual uses. But at least we are talking about of the ancient indigenous uses of psychedelics for about 5,000 years in Mesoamerica, right?
Beautiful. And I want to try and put a question here. You've got me thinking about, like, we look for evidence, for data, for proof, usually physical things. Like you're saying, mushrooms, they're made of water, they disappear. But what about spiritual proof? When we are using psychedelics, when we are kind of going into non-ordinary states of consciousness, perhaps we're tapping into some kind of a prehistoric, or in a sense infinite, outside of time and space reality, where we can experience those data points, that evidence, through our spirit, through our soul, through our consciousness. And that is collective, and it's universal and infinite. And that, to what extent could we conceptualize that as being kind of data points and proof of humanity's relationship spiritually with plant medicines and, the universe?
Yeah, it's interesting, your question. It is possible to organize the evidence in three different stages. Of course, the archaeological evidence for the ancient times, the historical evidence for colonial times, and contemporary evidence and ethnography for contemporary uses. The I am wonder because, for example, we were talking about the past, but nowadays, for example, indigenous people in Mexico still use peyote and psilocybin mushrooms for therapeutic, spiritual, and divinatory purposes. And of course, for example, regarding your question, it is possible to know since the colonial sources, since the written sources. It is possible, for example, to know the different rituals, the different cultural uses, and of course to know through different manuscripts and codices the gods related with psychedelics or psychoactive plants. For example, Xochipilli. I gave a talk in Harvard regarding Xochipilli. Xochipilli was the god of singing, joy, and fertility, and of course it was related with the use of different sacred plants. Or another example, it's Tlaloc. There is a very beautiful paper written by Bernardo Ortiz de Montellano called the Tlaloc herbs, las hierbas de Tlaloc in Spanish. And for example, Tlaloc was related with the Tagetes lucida, Yautli or Pericon, but also with psilocybin mushrooms. I highlight this fact at the end because mushrooms are not a plant, right? But according, for example, to historical sources, to the Borgia Codex and contemporary ethnographical research driven by indigenous scholars, for example, it is possible to match, the ancient sources, the archaeological evidence, the colonial sources, and the contemporary data in order to achieve a better understanding of these uses. And of course, it's possible to state clearly, for example, which Aztec or Maya deities were related with some specific sacred plants or fungi.
That's amazing. And what's your understanding of that personally? That how do you conceptualize that? That theory, that different plants have different connections or different pathways towards different gods, deities, spirits, or entities.
Well, because another thing that it's important to encourage in the research within psychedelic studies or within the psychedelic renaissance, for example, is the use or the study of indigenous languages. Everybody knows talk about psychologists, psychiatrists, and so on, but very few people talk about the significance of the linguist, right? And it's very important, for example, to understand the indigenous categories, the indigenous taxonomical systems, because if you make an effort, for example, to learn the indigenous languages, for example, you will achieve a better understanding of the taxonomy and the cultural uses of these plants, fungi, and animals. Due to this, it's very important to take into account, the humanities in this research, because of course it's my personal point of view, but I notice a lack of professional training within anthropologists that usually research indigenous cultures. And the weakest point always is the knowledge of indigenous languages, right? We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of homework, to develop in the future in order to avoid an epistemicide, right? In order to try to understand indigenous knowledge and indigenous worldview in their own terms, right? Due to this, it's very important, for example, the study of indigenous languages, and also to understand, for example, the ontological turn, right? It's necessary, for example, to understand this ontological turn in order, for example, to understand that the psychedelics or entheogens are related with sacred beings, are related with deities. For example, within indigenous view, sacred mushrooms are not isolated from the territory, and moreover are considered mushrooms or peyote are considered sacred beings, right? With which it's possible to establish communication to the ritual language. So it's important to make an effort and to make this ontological turn, because it's not only a scholarly matter, but also it's related with the struggles of indigenous peoples for territory. And also it's important to take into account that all these plant and fungi are not isolated from territory, are embedded in a setting, of cultural or different ontological relationship. Due to this, it's very important to achieve a better understanding of indigenous languages, and also it's necessary to encourage, because the old school, of course, make a great development regarding shamanism, entheogens, and so on and so on and so on. But nowadays, for example, it's very important to know the taxonomy, the indigenous taxonomies, right? And the contributions of indigenous knowledge of the psychedelic renaissance, because I want to highlight the following, the next fact. Um, Indigenous peoples have been the keepers of this ancestral knowledge for several centuries. And of course, if nowadays we have clinical trials, it's due to, or it's because indigenous peoples have been the keepers of this knowledge for several centuries. in difficult times when the Inquisitions tried to, you know, finish or eliminate these ritual and therapeutic uses of psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to take what you were just saying there, Osiris, around the ontological turn, apply it to the psychedelic renaissance as well, the medicalization of psychedelics, and even drug policy itself, because there is an ontology in each of those. And I think from just looking up about what ontological turn is, because I hadn't heard of that until I started researching for our podcast, it's creating, I think there is that tendency where we're trying to find this grand unified theory where everything kind of, in a sense, is homogenous, supports each other. It all fits into this nice kind of patchwork quilt of truth. Whereas I think what we're talking about here today is actually, there's quite distinct, separate traditions with realities, truths, and histories that may not necessarily be talking about the same thing or having the same experience. And so each of those is a separate world with its own ontological truth and framework. So where does the ontological turn happen? And then let's talk about what is it that we are actually needing collectively as a humanity around, say, drug policy and medicalization of psychedelics as kind of part two of this.
Yeah, for sure. For example, the first step is to acknowledge that within indigenous worldview, the earth, the mountains, the caves, for example, are entities endowed with life, right? And also the ontological term is related with ontological pluralism, you know, in order to avoid dogmatism or in order to move forward from only a Western or a biomedical approach, it's necessary to recognize this ontological pluralism. But this ontological pluralism also is related with legal pluralism, for example. And legal pluralism, for example, it's very important to recognize the rights of non-human beings, for example, the rights of nature, for example. And due to this, it's very important to follow this ontological turn, first in philosophical terms, but also it's not only a theoretical or a scholarly matter, it's related with practical purposes. And also the ontological turn and ontological pluralism are useful, for example, to understand the indigenous struggles for territory. In a paper written with a couple of Mojo scholars, with Keith Williams and Susan Brandt, entitled Indigenous Philosophies and the Psychedelic Renaissance, for example, we argue that one of the main differences between indigenous philosophy and Western philosophy is that the starting point of the Western philosophy it's the logos, the word, the reason, and so on. But regarding indigenous philosophy, the starting point it's not only the logos, it's the topos, it's the land, right? The ontological term, it's very useful to understand the indigenous struggles regarding land because, for example, they're considered entheogens or psychedelics are entities with which it's possible to establish communication through a ritual language.
So Osiris, I'm getting this feeling around using this term of ontological turn and the concepts that you just brought up of logos and topos. There's a difference in how we look at reality and our sense of place, and in a sense, individuality. I think, very much logos is, we could think about that in the psychedelic renaissance as thinking about problems with our own mental health, neuroplasticity being the solution, taking a drug and kind of psychopharmacology. Whereas, topos is more like a sense of place and meaning and ancestors and belonging. And it's more about the community, the systems, the structure of our culture that I am part of. So can you just kind of take us through that journey and give us some sense of why this is really important for how we conceptualize plant medicines and ourself.
Yeah, you're completely right, because also it's the territory, but also it's the concept of illness, right? And of course, it's very important, for example, to understand in different traditions, for example, or in Western, because I don't like the word Western, right? Due to this, I am struggling with this. But for example, in the Western worldview, it's very common to isolate, and we tend to talk about psilocybin, right, or mescaline, right? We focus on the substance, and it's not very common, for example, to take into account the entourage effect, right? The entourage effect or psilocybin mushrooms, or the entourage effect of peyote. In the case of indigenous philosophy, it's the same with territory. We tend to isolate, oh, mushrooms, or peyote, but it's not very common, for example, to take into account the interplay or the relationship, or in other words, the ontology, the set of relationship, for example, between the human being and the ecosystem, or acknowledge that peyote or psilocybin mushrooms are part of the ecosystems. They are not isolated. They are not isolated, for example, from territory, and we have to take this into account to achieve a better understanding. Another framework or another category very common in the field is non-human beings, or more than human beings. In order to understand these two categories, more than human or non-human beings, the ontological term is useful to extend, the scope of our understanding, and not only focus on the human beings. Due to this, for example, now in some countries of South America, for example, it's um, it's not strange, for example, to talk about land rights. You know, it's strange in the indigenous worldview to consider that the earth, that the land, it's a living being, right? So if we consider the land as a living being, of course, this ontological term, it's an heuristical tool to achieve a better understanding of this complex, uh, of this set of relationship between human beings and nature, or human beings and the ecosystem, right? Or human beings and the world. And for example, psychedelics are very powerful tools, you know, to achieve awareness of this relationship, because in our normal state of consciousness, we are not aware, right, of this set of relationship. But on the other hand, with the support, with the help of psychedelics, or with the psychedelic experience, we are able, for example, to be aware of this set of relationship between human beings and the world, that we are normally not understand in our normal states of consciousness.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. I love quite a few different points that you're making here. You started off saying about the entourage effect of, mushrooms and not just thinking about like the psilocin. And the same thing goes with cannabis as well. There's the entourage effect and iboga. And I think that we could also say there's an entourage effect with us as human beings. Like, if we just take ourselves out of our community, our family, the systems, but also our past, our history, and just think of ourselves as this patient with this assessment, with this diagnosis, then we're lacking our own cultural, humanistic, spiritual entourage effect, because we do belong in something that is not just ourselves. And in a sense, that is part of our sickness, is that we are disconnected from our entourage effect of our culture, our humanity, and a universal meaning that includes nature, that includes spirits, that includes non-human entities. And there's part of this tradition that is getting more popular now in the psychedelic kind of humanities space of eco-psychology and nature relatedness. And you've written as well, Osiris, around epistemic injustice and how the psychedelic renaissance, being a very medicalized model, individualized model, reductionist, particularly around kind of neuroscience and science, there's an epistemic injustice there. So I wonder, could you talk us through why what is an epistemic injustice in relationship to how the psychedelic renaissance is kind of exploding?
Yeah, sure. The epistemic injustice, for example, it's a framework developed by Miranda Fricker, in his research, in her research, sorry. And this epistemic injustice, for example, is related with the with the lack of recognition of indigenous knowledge, right?
Hmm.
Um, Now I am working on a project for the philosophy and psychedelics Exeter research group focus on the focus on globalization of psychedelics, the colonial ethics, and epistemic paradoxes. And within this psychedelic renaissance, we have to be aware of not reproduce neocolonial mechanism, because of course the war on drugs is a colonial legacy, okay? But, for example, the new efforts to reschedule psilocybin mushrooms or to reschedule peyote or to reschedule cannabis or to reschedule another different substances, we have to be aware to don't reproduce this neocolonial mechanism in this reschedule or regulation efforts. Or, in other words, according to a very beautiful paper written by Diana Negrin, there are some colonial shadows in the psychedelic renaissance, no? To use a metaphor, these colonial shadows, right? How to deal with these colonial shadows and how to overlook these colonial shadows, because sometimes these colonial shadows are deliberate, right? There are some interests embed on it, but another colonial shadows are um, unwillingness or involuntary, right? You know, we are these colonial shadows are unconscious, and we are reproducing unconsciously these colonial shadows. It's not a question of bad faith, for example, or a damage, or something previously planned. You know, sometimes these colonial shadows are reflect of an unconscious way of thinking, and due to this, it's very important to be aware of it in order to avoid reproduce it. And during my research, for example, I highlight these three paradoxes: the neocolonial paradox, right? The biomedical paradox, and the spiritual paradoxes. There are three epistemic paradoxes within the psychedelic renaissance, which is necessary to highlight. The neocolonial paradox, for example, it's necessary to be aware to avoid implementing neocolonial mechanism during this effort of decriminalize or reschedule these substances. On the other hand, for example, the biomedical paradoxes, it's grounded, for example, according to Christine Hauskeller, in another paradoxes, because we are using madness to cure madness. Moreover, according, for example, to the researcher Nessie Devenot, this globalization of psychedelics involves some risk, and perhaps it's possible that this medicalization of psychedelics It's possible, of course, it's an hypothesis that could exacerbate this set of mental illnesses instead of help to solve it, right? So it's necessary to be aware of these paradoxes. And the last one, for example, the spiritual paradox, it's interesting because it's a question for you and for your audience. It's legitimate to satisfy our spiritual needs meanwhile we are damaging the ecosystem because peyote, ayahuasca, and Buffalvarius toad are species which are under threat, you know, due to the overexploitation or due to the lack of sustainable policy, to avoid overexploitation of land, territory, raw materials, land, and so on. So it's interesting because a commonplace, a cliche in the psychedelic renaissance, it's to state that psychedelics reconnect you with nature. Okay, this is this is true, this is right, but we have to be aware, to avoid the overexploitation of the ecosystem to satisfy our spiritual needs. You know, this is a paradox. And of course, it's necessary to address these paradoxes from a philosophical or from a critical point of view. Of course, there are an open question. Someone could disagree, but during my research process, for example, I noticed these three epistemic paradoxes within the psychedelic renaissance, and of course, it's necessary or more research is required in order to overcome, or not only to overcome, but to achieve a better understanding of these paradoxes or contradictions. Because I notice also a very remarkable hype, you know, on psychedelics, but also it's important, for example, to highlight these paradoxes in order, for example, to develop better public policies regarding psychedelics worldwide, not only in the States, in the global north, or in the UK, but also, for example, in Mesoamerica, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Guatemala, in Africa, in Asia, and in different places of the world.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you, Osiris, that we have an inheritance from colonialism that casts these colonial shadows over drug policy and over the psychedelic renaissance. And it can be almost unconscious whether or not we notice that and acknowledge that. So what would you say around some of the conversations and advocacy work happening in the psychedelic space around decriminalization, legalization, decolonization? And I know you wrote that paper in 2022 titled, I think it was Decolonization is a Metaphor Towards a Different Ethic. So what are some of your thoughts here around kind of moving towards perhaps a synthesis that incorporates better drug policy and more plural understandings for why humans use psychedelics and how to enable them to use so in a liberal way?
Yeah, sure. There are some topics related with this issue. For example, decolonization. I wrote two papers, the one that you mentioned, and another book chapter called Decolonization: The Philosophy of Psychedelics. And for example, I noticed that the academic philosophy it's colonized, right? But also it's necessary, for example, to take into account indigenous knowledge, mainly indigenous philosophies, but also, for example, it's necessary to take into account the work of women. And in order to achieve, for example, the colonial approach, it's very important to take into account. Oh, David, yeah, it's very important to take into account, for example, the wisdom and the knowledge of indigenous peoples, but also it's very very important to develop a gender approach in order, for example, to recognize the work of women in psychedelics, and in order to decolonize our frameworks, it's very useful, for example, to move forward from these colonial shadows. Of course, the main colonial shadow or the main colonial legacy, it's the prohibition, right? The banning of psychedelic substances. It's interesting because in 4 centuries we are on the same spot, we are on the same place, we are not moving forward, to plenty cognitive liberty. And also, for example, the international legal framework is still shaping by this colonial legacy. This argument, for example, was developed by Martin Jay in his wonderful book, History of Mescaline, a history of the first global psychedelic, or something like that. And this is the first colonial legacy, the policies of prohibition. But also, we have to be aware that in the process of reschedule, or in the process of regulate, or in the process of decriminalize, because there are nuances, right? We have to be aware that in the reschedule or the criminal efforts, don't reproduce neocolonial mechanism, right? Perhaps unconsciously, yeah. Perhaps we are doing these efforts with good faith, you know, and with not deliberate purpose of damage, but perhaps unconsciously, you know, we are reproducing some this neocolonial mechanism. Let me give you an example. You know, how many indigenous researchers are involved in the forefront of the psychedelic renaissance?
Not
How
many at
many
all.
scholarships? How many scholarships for indigenous scholars? You know, how many directive, positions for indigenous scholars, or the development of better public policies, for example, cross-cultural clinics, right? Or different educational and social programs in order to achieve a reciprocity, or at least some recognitions, as I previously mentioned, of to indigenous knowledge, in order to be the keepers of this knowledge for centuries. Nowadays, we are able to perform clinical trials because indigenous people resist and preserve this knowledge for centuries, for example, against the Inquisition, right? This is the value, for example, of the contribution of Maria Sabina, or the Huichol Birrárica people, or the Nahua people, for example, this resistance. And of course, in a question of reciprocity, it's important to recognize, for example, this resistance. And of course, cultural uses are evolving, right? Culture, it's an open, it's an open issue. And nowadays, we we have a great opportunity, for example, to develop a cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy, or a cross-cultural psychiatry, right? In a broader scope, across cultural democracy. But this is a topic for another program. This is not a program on political science, right? But of course, it will be possible to develop a cross cultural psychiatry, for example, and a cross cultural psychedelic therapy. This will be a way, for example, to overcome, in part, these colonial shadows, these colonial legacies within the psychedelic renaissance. Another way to overcome this colonial legacy is to recognize the different cultural uses of psychedelics. When Michel Foucault traveled to California, and he went to the Death Valley and experienced with LSD, his project was to develop a cultural history on psychedelics, right? Unfortunately, he was not able to do it because he had another projects, another ideas, and so on and so on. And in my research, for example, of course, I am not attempting to do a history of cultural uses of psychedelics because it's too long, but I want to highlight the different cultural uses. And this is very important because if we recognize the cultural uses, we can develop, we can perform, we can apply better public policies, we can avoid ambiguities, we can avoid misunderstandings, and of course, we can uh, reach, we can enhance our scope of the cultural uses of psychedelics. I consider that this is a vein of research that requires further support, further efforts, because, as I previously mentioned, we focus on psychedelic science, and of course, it's good, it's okay because it's a chink in the armor, but also take into account the role of the psychedelic humanities to understand, or to better understand, the cultural uses. This is very important. I want to highlight because there is not too much research performed, regarding cultural uses. There is a lot of research regarding pharmacology, you know. There is a lot of research regarding clinical trials, you know. There is a lot of research regarding shamanism, right? This is the three main axes. But also we need to move to other veins of research.
Yeah, really interesting to imagine how things could look in the future. But it could be a number of different ways. And I think part of what we're talking about here is it needs to be a number of different ways, not just one way, not just this kind of homogenous, clinical trial or medicalized model. And there's a couple of people I know that are using that kind of cross-cultural approach to psychedelic therapy. One of whom is in Victoria Island University, Shannon Dames, and Pam Crisco, and also actually a colleague that introduced us originally, Osiris, Anya Lozaigo Velda in Mexico, doing work that incorporates that, the Veleda, I think if I pronounced that right, but bringing in more shamanic, ceremonial, indigenous traditions and knowledges around ceremony uses and psychedelic assisted therapy. So do you think that should exist alongside the more kind of clinical scientific model as an option?
Yeah, it's possible. For example, Anja, with another people, of course, perform and develop an interest cross-cultural research in the north of Mexico, a cross-cultural clinic which used to give psychedelic assisted therapy with ayahuasca that comes from South America, but within Mexican indigenous communities, right? This was a very beautiful project of a cross-cultural approach. Of course, it is possible to develop it. It's a kind of utopia, right? It's a kind of a dream. For example, the develop of these cross-cultural clinics, for example, within indigenous community, and in the contribution of these clinics, for example, is the freedom of choice. For example, the freedom of choice. For example, the freedom to choose the Western model or the indigenous model, right? For example, in this cross cultural matching, and of course, for example, to incorporate or to recognize, for example, some collective, aspects of the psychedelic assisted therapy, because as you highlight, the Western model, it's based on an individual, a kind of confessional dispositive, and so on and so on. And also, it's important to take into account the collective, aspect of the psychedelic assisted therapy, the cross cultural character, the role of music, the role of set and setting, perhaps make some contributions regarding set and setting. And of course, due to this, it's very important to achieve an holistic approach of these therapies. And of course, the development of a cross-cultural psychiatry or a cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy, it's a challenge in the future, but it's a beautiful challenge, for researchers try to match, these different sources of knowledge.
Yeah, and maybe coming back to cognitive liberty in that part of your work, there's, the psychedelic renaissance, there's an assumption that psychedelics, in a sense, there's a gatekeeping to who should get them, who qualifies for them, and typically it's around pathology. Someone needs a diagnosis in order to qualify to use psychedelics, and that's kind of quite a binary yes or no, because it's based on kind of medical need and necessity, and sometimes there's this expectation that you have to have tried SSRIs first and other medications, and only then you can use psilocybin or cannabis. But from an approach that's based around cognitive liberty, there doesn't need to be a diagnosis. There doesn't need to be a pathology. There doesn't even need to be a problem to fix. There can be simply pleasure. I want to explore my consciousness. I like how it feels when I enter that realm of, feeling my body more, having more of a spiritual experience, feeling more connected to the land and my ancestors. And so that's moving more into that psychedelic humanities approach that you're advocating for, that incorporates cognitive liberty to make our own choices based on a process of decision making that only I can have, only you can have, rather than a licensing board or a government about who should get access to them and what the reasons are to be allowed to access plant medicines and our own consciousness.
Yeah, sure. For example, politics of prohibition undermine cognitive liberties in two ways: collective and individuals. Because politics of prohibition, for example, undermine scientific research for decades, not only at individual levels, at institutional level. For example, for how many decades universities stop research on psychedelics due to this politics of prohibition? At least 3 decades, right? Uh, this is a collective. This is a collective damage, right? On the other hand, for example, the politics of prohibition undermined the right of cognitive liberty. The right to explore your own mind, for example, the right to use psychedelics for philosophical purposes, right? For creative or artistic purposes, right? And these are veins of research that is necessary to address, not in the future but in the present. And due to this, humanities are very useful, for example, to address these veins of research with a different approach, but not only with a different approach, but also with good methodologies, right? From history, for example, and anthropology, philosophy, and all the methodologies involved in the humanities are useful in order, to develop a more holistic approach on the different cultural uses of psychedelics.
Quick question, Osiris. Have you met Bruce Damer and the new organization, the Center for Minds? It's very new.
No,
No.
no. But I will make some research and.
Yeah, I'll make an introduction because I met with them a couple of weeks ago,
Oh,
and they're creating this, in a sense, a manifesto around the benefits for psychedelics to be used not just for clinical reasons, but for innovative reasons, for creativity, but also kind of creative problem solving. So it might be how to solve problems around, climate change, for example. But there's something really beautiful around the potential for psychedelics to be used in really novel ways, because we've got massive problems in the world. And yeah, there's a lot of pathology and unhappiness and conflict. And we shouldn't expect psychedelics necessarily to be this kind of magic, panacea. But there is something that our minds have the potential to unlock through new ways of perceiving a problem if we are allowed to. And that's, kind of innovation, and it's peace building. And it's, I think, going to lead to more sustainable ways of existence. And just for me, as I'm a clinically trained social worker, psychotherapist. I've had to unlearn so much of my training, and I'm still doing it now. Like, we've got this 12-month training course, Vital, which I love. We're in round 3 of it now. And I keep wanting to be more clinical because I'm a clinical therapist. I want to work in clinics and hospitals and save the world, as a therapist. But actually, I'm realizing through being in Vital, through being part of this course for 3 years, there's so much more about psychedelics and its potential when we take it outside of this rigid framework and almost like a straitjacket and scaffolding of the clinical medical approach. Because it's so much more than that, and we're trying to kind of box it in and limit it, I think, because we're scared of being shut down. We're scared of saying, you're illegal, you're criminalized, that's not valid. Spirituality and kind of humanistic reasons aren't good enough. We just have to keep it here. Otherwise, the bad people are going to come and make it illegal again. So I'm kind of doing some personal healing around that. But I think we need to go through this process collectively as well as individually to say, actually, psychedelics are much more than just this pill or this kind of medical intervention.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you. First, it's necessary to recognize that psychedelics are not magic bullets, right? And also it's necessary to develop critical thinking. Of course, it's good this evolving to a more open space, but also it's necessary to don't be naive, you know, or don't fall in the temptation or an excessive hype on psychedelics. It's necessary to reflect from different perspectives. Also, of course, therapeutic uses of psychedelics are ancient as the human being, as the mankind, right? But also, it's necessary to open, our overview. And for example, creative uses of psychedelics, for example, are overlooked, right? Because we focus more on therapeutic, right, on religious or ceremonial uses, but creative aesthetic uses are also important. And fortunately nowadays there are some research moving on that way, but not too much, right? And of course it's important, for example, to take into account this aesthetic research. There is a long tradition, for example, of the relationship between psychedelics and literature, right? Aldous Huxley, and other authors and other writers who wrote on it, Allen Ginsberg, the Beat Generation, Jack Kerouac, Jack Burroughs, Greensberg, and so on, Aldous Huxley. And also, for example, visionary artists as Alex Gray or the Huichol painters or different contemporary Mazatec artists. And I guess that the art it's underexplored vein of research. And of course, for example, psychedelics will be very useful to explore this vein of creative work because, for example, the one of the most significant roles of these neurotropic molecules, it's their impact on imagination, right? But we tend to identify imagination with the false, right? With the fantasy, with the illusion, right? And we are not willing to recognize the role of imagination, for example, in the building of scientific knowledge, or how, for example, imagination it's good for living in our daily life.
Yeah.
So this power of psychedelics in order to strengthen our imagination, right? Unfortunately has been overlooked, but the potential, you know it's really huge, right? It's an open horizon. Of course, it's the same way in the case of philosophical uses. It's more uh, um, it's more close to us, the art, but also philosophical uses have the same potential, and also hedonistic or adult or recreational uses in order to recognize. But also, in the case of hedonistic, of recreational uses of psychedelics, we have to be aware of one fact. And I use an analogy with the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. We have to be very aware of the trivialization of the psychedelic experience, right? It's not
Yes.
the same to recognize that there are hedonistic, you know, or uses for pleasure, you know, that which are different of the trivialization of the psychedelic experience, right? And we have to be aware of this trivialization of psychedelic experience, for example, in order to overcome the cultural stereotypes, the cliches, the stigma, and the racialization and criminalization of users, right? But it will be useful to overcome all these cultural dilemmas.
Yeah, really, really powerful point there. And I think there's so many people who do not talk about their uses of psychedelics or cannabis because they feel like, oh, maybe I don't have a good enough reason. And people think, yeah, I've got a problem or I'm doing it in the wrong way. And yeah, there's something there around trusting ourselves. And it takes often a long time to really know, yeah, I'm doing this for good reasons. Like, I don't need any more kind of logic to kind of justify what I'm doing to anyone else. It's just me, my soul, my conscience that knows this is helping, or this is simply good for me, or it's a kind of good way to spend some of my life in these ways. And that's part of the work of Carl Hart. He's saying that, like, you can go into that space, and that's part of, I think, being a grown-up. Drug use for grown-ups is like being honest and accountable to oneself in a responsible way. This is something that I need, I want, it's good for me. And I think we need to be able to see ourselves individually and collectively from that place of authenticity and deeper conversations around our decision-making ability.
Yeah, sure. And for example, I am very glad to share this space of freedom of thought, you know,
Mm.
because we are the freedom of thought to address these different issues, these different topics, but also according to the framework developed by Miranda Fricker regarding epistemic injustice, right? There are a lot of things to do or to move forward in order to overcome these imbalances of power, these cultural stereotypes, this racialization. But also, I want to highlight one concept: this deficit of credibility. For example, this space of psychedelics today, it's very important, for example, to encourage the freedom of thought, you know, in order to overcome this deficit of credibility, right? Because in the mainstream academia or in the general audience, unfortunately, prevail a stigma, you know, and a deficit of credibility. Oh, these researchers who are focused on psychedelics, perhaps they are, the stereotype of the mad scientist, or they are strange people or rare people, or perhaps they are not high or top researchers, right? You know, uh, uh, the courage to deal with psychedelic research also imply to assume personal consequences, and one of these personal consequences is to face this deficit of credibility, right? Due to this, I am very grateful to open this conversation, to open these spaces, because these spaces are very useful to overcome this deficit of credibility, because in the mainstream mass media not always is possible, the time in TV, it's very expensive, the editorial criteria of the mainstream media not always are willing, for example, to cover, the psychedelic research. And due to this, I am very glad to be here with you, talking about this deficit of credibility. And I hope so that this will be helpful to overcome this deficit of credibility, right?
Yeah, that concept of credibility feels really important. Now that you've mentioned that, I can feel that in my body, because there's this binary gate: yes, no, good, bad, allowed or disallowed, kind of valid or invalid, in a sense, like grown up and childish, or mature, immature, around drugs and consciousness and
Primitive
decision
and
making.
modern.
Right, so we have to be modern and grown up, and come on, don't. And in a sense, that's the imagination. Like when you're talking about the imagination, there's a deficit of credibility around our imagination that, and I think, kind of almost imprisons our imagination, our innovation, that spark of thought and freedom within ourselves that starts to get repressed, and we start to, in a sense, forget that it even exists. So yeah, I think, and I love that you're a philosopher, because it gives you the ability to create terms that have power and meaning, and when we sit with them and feel them, like just this idea of the deficit of credibility, what controls our narrative, colonial shadows, and epistemic injustice, these terms have power, that when we sit with them and feel with them and understand them, it's very motivating. And so I want to take some of these concepts now, Osiris, and let's talk about Mexico, where you are right now. What's happening right now on a tangible level with drug policy? And I know you said, 20, 30 years ago, the war on drugs and prohibition really hit Mexico. But I've also heard that there's a push for some legalization, decriminalization, rescheduling around all drugs, particularly because of the drug cartels and the violence in Mexico, but particularly around the indigenous use of psilocybin mushrooms. And there's a president that used to be there in Mexico, Vicente Fox, and he was pretty right-wing, I remember. And now I've been reading that he's actually coming out for legalizing drugs or decriminalizing. It's similar to, in a sense, how Rick Perry in Texas was a governor. He was very right-wing. I don't know if he had his own psychedelic experiences, but now he's coming out around decrim and research and legalization, for psychedelics, particularly for, first responders and veterans. But there seems to be, these leaders are having changes of mind. What's the situation right now in Mexico around this conversation of credibility and epistemic injustice and drug policy?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting case because, as I previously mentioned, Mexico is the region of the world with the largest amount of psychoactive plants, and cultural uses of psychedelics during history. Nowadays, there is an attempt to reschedule psilocybin mushrooms in order to allow research, because nowadays in Mexican law there are some exemption, for example, for indigenous peoples to use psilocybin mushrooms and peyote for ceremonial purposes. But non-indigenous populations, Afro-Mexican populations, and other social sectors are not allowed to use psychedelics. Moreover, the Mexican legal framework includes natural mushrooms in the prohibition, right? In the international, for example, framework focus on synthetic psilocybin and not on natural mushrooms, right? The Mexican legal framework it's more strict than the
Wow.
international law. This is a paradox, right? Fortunately, nowadays there is an initiative to reschedule, psilocybin mushrooms from the list number 1 to list number 3 or 4. And one of the goals, for example, of this project is to provide psychedelic cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy in the public health system, right?
Great,
With
great.
psilocybin mushrooms, not with synthetic psilocybin, right? And one of the goals, because psilocybin mushrooms is a resource of the country, one of the goals, for example, is to establish these cross-cultural clinics and to provide these two services, of course, one based on Western approach, and another, for example, based on indigenous wisdom, and try to match if it is possible, right? Unfortunately, this politics of prohibition, for example, stop and undermine liberty cognitive and scientific research. For example, nowadays there are almost 400, uh, 400 clinical trials around the world, 450, more or less, so on and so on. But paradoxically, continuing with the with the paradoxes, for example, in Mexico, due to the legal framework, we are not able to do studies with human beings, right?
Mm.
Only preclinical studies, because the legal framework is so strict, right? That, for example, perhaps psychedelic tourism is more tolerated, due to the revenues and so on and so on. But for example, in order to develop or perform scientific research, the legal framework is very strict. Meanwhile, in UK, in US, in Canada, perhaps in Germany or in other countries, there have funding or different legal framework that allow, these clinical trials. Due to this, it's very important to perform a reschedule to perform these clinical trials, but also more important, to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples,
Beautiful. Yeah,
right? For
fundamentally.
example,
Yeah.
yeah, to protect, for example, indigenous people, not to protect, but to guarantee the rights of indigenous people against biopiracy, biohacking, you know, provide the opportunity, for example, to indigenous peoples to provide psilocybin services, you know, the possibility, for example, to create a department of traditional medicine or indigenous medicine within the Ministry of Health, in order to develop this educational and research program to achieve a cross-cultural psychedelic assisted therapy.
Amazing. That there is such a huge paradox with what you're saying, Osiris, around how the kind of prohibition and the shadow of it, of colonialism through that, is preventing the research around psychedelics, psilocybin, in the place in the world where it grows most freely and has most varieties. And at the same time, Mexico is filled with ibogaine retreat centers and 5-MAO retreat centers and, kind of psilocybin services. And how can that's okay, but not the actual research itself? It's really bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a paradox, right? And as a philosopher, for example, we have to address all this contradiction and all these paradoxes. And also our work is to provide a better frameworks, because the boom of this psychedelic renaissance, for example, I read a very beautiful book published by Cambridge University Press called Philosophy of Psychopharmacology, right? Not psychedelics, but philosophy of psychopharmacology. And one of the roles of philosophy is to provide better frameworks and also to reflect on ethical dilemmas regarding, this medicalization of psychedelic and psychotropic substances. Yeah, this is the book. For example, when we were talking about, for example, the one of the roles of the philosophy within the psychedelic research is to provide better frameworks. This is our duty, right? Provide better frameworks and methodology. And for example, this book, Philosophy of Pharmacology, was written before the boom of the psychedelic renaissance, right? It was published by Cambridge University Press. It's not focused on psychedelics, it's focused on, on other topics. But it's a philosophy approach, it's a philosophical approach. And one of the roles of philosophy is to provide better frameworks. For example, you mentioned colonial shadows, ontological turn, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, this is part of our job, of our duty, Perhaps, for example, if you have hundreds of psychedelic experience, but if you don't have the the appropriate frameworks, perhaps these experiences are not really useful. On the other hand, if you have too much theory, but you don't have the experience, or you don't have, for example, the knowledge of indigenous worldviews, the knowledge of indigenous languages, you know, the knowledge of the taxonomy, indigenous taxonomy systems, because perhaps you have all the theory or the experience, but you don't have the right frameworks, to better understand the psychedelic experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Just on a basic level, we need both. We need some experience of our inner worlds. We need some kind of research and frameworks to understand our experiences. Both are really important. This has been an amazing conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. There's one more thing that you mentioned before we pressed record, Osiris, and that really interests me. You mentioned there's I think like a 400-year-old manuscript around peyote, and there's something happening with it. Can you just tell us what's going on over there?
Yes, this is a really interesting manuscript. I have been working in these inquisitorial archives of peyote, right, in order to better understand the process of banning peyote, right? But on November of 23, 3 months ago, I went to the University of Wisconsin Madison because they organize a symposia on psychedelics. They have a research center, very well um, structured. And the Memorial Library of the University of Wisconsin Madison bought a manuscript from 1619, from 17th century. And
Mm,
this manuscript was the professional study of the rector of the royal and the rector of the Real y Pontificia Universidad de Mexico at that time. You know, he had 73 years and he was an advisor for the Inquisition, right? The
mm,
the the Inquisition, um, request and study, for a professional, right? And this manuscript is the study of this professional scholar regarding the different cultural uses of peyote. And this study was used by the Inquisition, for example, to establish this peyote banning, right? This is an unstudied and unpublished manuscript. This is an exclusive for psychedelic uh, today's. The
mm.
research is going on, and of course, the goal is to match this document, right, with the Inquisition Edict of 1620, which is hosted at the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University. There is one copy, and another copy in the National Archive in Mexico. But also in the National Archive in Mexico, there are more than 100 documents or 100 archives regarding the peyote trials. The goal is to gather these three different sources of documents. The one that which is at the Memorial Library at the University of Wisconsin Madison, the another one that is in the John Carter Brown Library, and 100 manuscripts that are in the National Archives in Mexico, in order to address and to understand, to achieve a better understanding of the process of peyote banning, right? This
Wow.
is an unpublished and an undone work, and hopefully will be ready during this year. I received the support of the people of the University of Wisconsin Madison, the director of Latin American Studies, Alberto Vargas, and of course the training resides with Professor Erika Dick was very useful, for example, in order to develop this archive work, and we hope that this will be a contribution in the field because the topic, the understanding of the inquisitorial process of the peyote banning, which is shaping our drug policy nowadays, and of course, an unpublished, manuscript, right? That the value is double, an unpublished and unstudied manuscript, but also a better understanding of an historical process, an important historical process regarding peyote.
Yeah, sends shivers down my spine. It really does, because it helps us understand our contemporary drug policy and our kind of restricted, I think, consciousness around framing the use of psychedelics. And it gives it some roots. Yeah, this was a very political and religious and colonial inheritance around peyote, but
Yeah,
also
for
all
sure.
psychedelics and drugs.
For example, one amazing thing as a researcher, for example, I am focused on the study of the different metaphors, used by this Inquisition advisor to refer peyote. For example, diabolic diabolic visions, you know,
Mm.
these plans of Satan, idolatry, witchcraft, hallucinations, all these words used to frame, or to deny the spiritual and therapeutic uses, but mainly the spiritual uses of peyote by Spanish friars are by the Inquisition, for example, are very interesting. And now I am, examining or analyzing, for example, these metaphors, not only the metaphors, but also, for example, the therapeutic uses of peyote, the divinatory uses of peyote, the arguments used by inquisitors and friars in order, for example, to banning the peyote, and it's really interesting. And hopefully, this will be a contribution not only for researchers, or specialists in the field, but also for general audience. It's really interesting to look into these inquisitorial archives.
Amazing, amazing. And understanding what was happening 405 years ago is helpful for understanding what's been happening since the 1960s and 70s, and with President Nixon in America, and that recently, I don't know how recent, but there's been some public admissions and acknowledgement that yes, this wasn't based on science or public protection. It was based on kind of political and racial ideology as a kind of ontological framework that was racist. And there was, I think, the admission by John Ehrlichman that was saying, this wasn't based on science. It was based on, kind of repressing hippies and Jews and black people. That was the original intention. So what was the original intention of the kind of the Spanish conquistadors in the 1600s? It was on, oppression and dominance and, probably, brainwashing by removing the indigenous traditional ontological framework and ceremonial and cultural traditions.
Yeah, sure. For example, fortunately, nowadays, scientific evidence shows that the current drug policy is anachronic, right? You know, Scientific evidence shows that this drug policy is anachronic. Why? Because, for example, scientific evidence shows that peyote, mescaline, that mescaline, psilocybin, DMT, you know, have therapeutic potential, right? This classification on Schedule 1 is not justified anymore,
Mm-mm,
right?
never was,
Because
yeah.
because yeah, anymore, right? And this is a good sign, right? Scientific evidence shows that our current drug policy is anachronic, but we have to take into account also this humanistic approach to achieve a better understanding of these cultural uses, because if we achieve a better understanding of these cultural uses, we can avoid misunderstanding, pain, unnecessary suffering, social conflicts, racialization, harm drug reduction policies, and so on and so on. And due to this, it's very important to recognize these different cultural uses, not only two, the religious and the therapeutic, but at least four more in order to develop better public policies.
100%. 100%. I'm with you. This has been amazing. Before we wrap up, Osiris, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you want to mention, as well as just telling people how to find your work or to get more information about you personally?
Well, first of all, thanks, David, to open this space to cognitive liberty, to freedom of thought. I feel very honored to collaborate with this effort, and I don't have anything to add. Only to invite your audience to follow your podcast. And in the case of my research, of course, I have a web site in academia, point edu. You can find book chapters, papers, articles, and so on. If you are interested, for example, in go deeper in some of these specific topics, and I am in the process of building a web page. Hopefully, in 1 month or so, it will be ready, for example. And my goal is to gather, for example, all these papers that are in different places. Also, for example, I am member of Via Synapsis. We have a Facebook site, and we organized since 9 years ago the University Congress on Psychoactive Substances. It's in Spanish mainly, but also, for example, in the web pages of the Philosophy and Psychedelics Exeter Research Group and in the University of Saskatchewan, you can find some information regarding my research and some links to some papers or interviews or educational resources.
Wonderful. Yeah, you're really collaborating with the best people out there, heart-centered people, and great organizations. And I'd love to see that website. If you can get that up and running by the time we get this podcast out, we'll pop it in the show notes along with all the other links.
Yeah, hopefully, I will be working on that this month in order to.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for listening to this episode of Psychedelics Today. Dr. Osiris González Romero, thank you so much for everything you're doing, all the work, the passion, and the critical thinking. It's amazing to hear what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the invitation. I am very glad to share this thought with you and with your audience.
All right, take care, everyone. God bless.